Thank you so much. That was an incredible panel and incredibly important. I am now very pleased to be able to introduce our third and final keynote speaker of the conference. Those of you who were here yesterday got a glimpse into Pamela's awesome moderating, and she will be sharing some thoughts with us today. You guys might read her columns in the New York Times. So Pamela Paul is an opinion columnist for the New York Times. She writes about culture, politics, ideas, and last year she published a column called "It Takes a Lifetime to Survive Childhood Cancer." And this article has really kind of had a life of its own, and a year later, here she is with us today. Pamela is also the author and editor of 9 books, including the children's book Rectangle Time, and other titles including How to Raise a Reader, 100 Things We've Lost to the Internet, and My Life with Bob, and Bob stands for Book of Books. If you love reading and you love traveling, I highly recommend My Life with Bob, or the Bob Book, as I call it. Books played a crucial role in my childhood, and I have a theory that they do play a similar role for other children going through traumatic life experiences. Because when you're reading a book, you can be taken out of your own reality and into a world of someone else's. You can be transported back to the 1800s and have adventures on the prairie with Laura Ingalls Wilder, or learn magic spells with Harry Potter and his friends. And while you're reading or being read to, you don't have to think about your own reality. You don't have to think about the fact that you have cancer. You don't have to think about the next time you're having an exam under anesthesia and dreading that gas mask being strapped to your face. You don't have to think about the horrible nausea and vomiting that occur after you wake up from anesthesia. And so when this article was published last year, it offered readers a momentary break from what's going on in their own world and a glimpse into what it is like to be an adult survivor of pediatric cancer. It showed that even once you are cancer-free or in remission, it's only the tip of the iceberg for your cancer journey, because cancer never leaves you. And I think most importantly, this article brought retinoblastoma to the forefront, and it showed the harsh truth that in the United States, we have a very long way to go in taking care of our adult survivors of pediatric cancer. Also, incredibly importantly, it showed that pediatric cancer survivors are resilient. They're tough as nails, and as we've seen over the last couple of days, they can do anything that they put their mind to. We have survivors here and on our videos that are lawyers and doctors, own their own companies, run their own nonprofits. I mean, it is not the end of the world. Words are powerful. Words make a difference, and words create change. And creating change is exactly what we are doing at One Retinoblastoma World. It is such an honor to be able to say thank you in person to you in front of the world's leaders in retinoblastoma care. Thank you for your words, because they will have a lasting impact, and they show the world that pediatric cancer survivors can do anything we want. Thank you, and please welcome Pamela Paul.
Amazing. I was worried about having to follow Clay. Now I have to follow Clay and Marissa. I feel really humbled to be here because I'm an outlier here at the conference. I'm not a survivor of retinoblastoma, nor has anyone in my family had retinoblastoma, nor have I ever offered life-saving treatment to a patient with retinoblastoma. But I have been touched by retinoblastoma, and in a way I never would have predicted. I came to this subject as a journalist, and I wrote about retinoblastoma in the story that Marissa referred to in the New York Times almost exactly a year ago, October 6th, 2023. So I felt that it was only natural for me to approach this talk by telling you a story, not about retinoblastoma per se, because all of you know this disease far better than I do, but whether you've experienced it directly or have treated it or researched it, but as a journalist. So I first started writing about cancer in the mid-2000s, and when I was working on my first story about cancer, it was about women who get diagnosed with cancer while pregnant. I remember I was at the house of a close friend of mine who is an oncologist, and I told him really excitedly about this story I was working on, and his response was, "Why are you telling this story? Shouldn't it be an oncologist who's telling the story?" And it really took me aback, and I didn't have an answer, a ready answer, because what he was really asking was like, what are journalists for? Because that is what we do. And I gave it a great deal of thought, and the way I think about it, or the way I thought about it then and the way I think about it now is that, yes, oncologists can tell this story, their version of this story, and there are so many incredible oncologist writers, doctor writers, Siddhartha Mukherjee, Jerome Groopman, Atul Gawande, Azar Raza. I'm sure many of you have read books by oncologists, and it's true too that all patients can tell a story, and I have friends who have had cancer who've told their own stories, their own memoirs. But what I try to do as a journalist is to work outside of that perspective of direct experience and to try to take in all of these stories and to create something that I hope will reach readers who might also not necessarily have direct experience with cancer themselves, but who can then read it in a way that is meaningful to them as it is to me in learning about it for the first time. So with this story, I'm going to tell you about how it was made and the process of how it came together, and also, and this happens to journalists all the time, about how a story changes. And in the end, in an ideal world, that changed story, whatever it might be, in some way changes the author, me, and then when it reaches its readers, in the best case scenario, its audience, when it's done right, it changes them in some way as well. So my path to this particular story was a long and circuitous one. It's actually the story that I've spent the longest time working on and thinking about in my career. 14 years ago, in 2010, I was a freelance writer, and I was focused largely on issues related to health and medicine, science and the family, and in particular on the intersection between science and medicine and real life as we all live it. And at that time, I subscribed to a lot of email services that would send me updates from scientific and medical journals. And a number of studies landed in my inbox one day in 2010 that showed that there were these distressing long-term side effects of surviving childhood cancer. Often in the public narrative, right, surviving cancer is framed as this unalloyed success story. You've made it. Everything is fine now. You're a survivor. But according to these studies, survivors of cancer grew up to experience higher rates of depression, anxiety, infertility. I'd recently, as I mentioned, written a story for the New York Times Magazine about women who get cancer while pregnant, but I hadn't given much thought to pediatric cancer before. And the medical circumstances between these two terrible situations is very different, but they pose similar, really heartrending questions about what it means to experience the joy of new life and the threat of death simultaneously. And what I wondered as I read those studies, what does it mean to survive cancer when cancer survival in a scientific and medical sense is measured at 5 years? What does that mean for a 3-year-old? What are the effects of both the cancer and the treatment on a developing body and mind, on a developing person? And then I also asked myself, well, how exactly do we know this? Because I think as has become clear in this conference, and you all know, American medicine is not very good at longitudinal research. We don't have a central place for a lot of our scientific research in this country. So I was really curious as to how we knew about these long-term effects of cancer treatment decades later. So I thought there might be a story here, and I sent a query out over a listserv to ask if I could talk to any survivors of pediatric cancer. When you're pitching a story as a journalist, you usually try to have like one real-life experience to kind of get your editor interested in and sort of emotionally involved in the story, and I needed that for my query. And I immediately heard back from a man who was in his 30s at the time. I ended up spending several hours on the phone with him, and by the end, both of us were in tears, though I tried to hide mine as a professional journalist. But he really made me understand how profound and enduring that early life experience can be. I hadn't even considered the possibility of survivor guilt, for example. At one point, he said to me, "Why did I live and everyone else on my ward died?" I was in a group of authors at that time, and one of the women in the group had recently written a book about sibling loss. Her brother had been the boy in the bubble. You might remember John Travolta played him in the TV movie. And her brother was the boy that story was based on, and her book was about the unexplored experience of sibling loss and illness. And she had spoken to a number of people for her book who had had some version of that experience. And that book awakened me to the idea that illnesses don't just happen to one person. They reverberate throughout a family. They affect parents who often become full-time caregivers. They affect older children who are sometimes drawn into a caregiving role. They affect brothers who feel like they have to carry the mantle for a younger brother, or siblings who feel compelled to be the good one in the family or the easy child. There are kids who might feel overlooked and jealous of a sibling who's taking up all the family's attention, and then guilty about their own neediness when there is a child in the family who's fighting for his life, and who feel like part of their own childhood may have been lost, but that they were also given an early gift of maturity and perspective and empathy. So I wanted to write a story about the way in which pediatric cancer affects not just the patient, but the entire family. And I wanted to write about the idea that illness doesn't just exist in a moment in time, but that it stays with a person and becomes part of the person and part of a family's story and legacy that never goes away, for good and for ill, for the rest of their lives. I wanted to know what we might learn from this cohort of early pediatric cancer patients. Now that cancer is detectable at ever earlier stages, many adults are becoming long-term survivors as well, going on to live decades after their treatment. And I asked, what could we learn about cancer at all ages by studying those it strikes first? And just as I was putting together what I hoped would be a powerful pitch for this story, despite the fact that all my editors at Time and my editors at the New York Times Magazine and at Vogue Magazine, these places where I regularly wrote about science, health, and family issues, had routinely told me that my story ideas were always depressing and too dark. I actually feel like this is a story of hope. We'll get there. I found that I was unable to write the story. I'd been working for 9 years at home as a freelancer at the time, writing magazine and newspaper stories and books while raising and giving birth to and raising 3 young children, very determined never to work in an office again and never wanting to get out of my pajamas, when I decided almost on a whim to join the New York Times as their part-time children's books editor. And like many part-time jobs, that role quickly became a full-time job, and before I knew it, I was running a department of 24 people with no time to delve into a subject as big as pediatric cancer, while also juggling a full-time job and 3 full-time kids. So reluctantly, I tucked my research into a file folder, and I put it on a standing file folder on top of my desk, but I never forgot about it. And I actually went back and used that original file when I came back to this story. I kept an eye out to see if anyone else wrote about these questions that had tugged at me at the time, and I was genuinely surprised that no major newspaper or magazine covered the story of that first generation to survive pediatric cancer in the interim. I didn't know it then, but I also stopped working on the story before I even really understood what those studies I'd seen meant. I had still thought of pediatric cancer as a necessarily dark story. I didn't know, for example, that while those early studies sounded scary with their statistics about suicide and depression and anxiety, the reality was more complicated and not nearly as bleak. I didn't realize that the numbers themselves were really small, and so the increased risks were also relative and based on very small populations. I didn't know any of that then. It took Marissa Gonzalez, who is, of course, legally blind, to get me to see a much clearer picture and a much more hopeful one. But I'm jumping ahead of my story. So 12 years went by. Cancer stayed in my life in the way that it touches many people's lives. My aunt had a recurrence of breast cancer and died in her 50s. My father died of esophageal cancer 1 month to the day after he was diagnosed. Friends of mine got cancer, including another person who was in that group of authors. It's the same person who wrote the book about sibling loss, Catherine Russell Rich. Perhaps some of you have read her. She wrote a cancer memoir called The Red Devil. People here might know what that refers to. She had what her doctors had called a wimpy cancer for over a decade, and even wrote a second book about learning Hindi before ultimately cancer did end her life. And then in the fall of 2022, 2 chance encounters revived the questions that had still preoccupied me over the intervening years. First, I interviewed an oncologist at Dana-Farber who had written a book, a memoir about his wife's cancer, and we started talking about the subject of cancer and the subject of writing books about cancer. And I confess that I had been wanting to write about this story for a long time, but I'd nearly given up having the time or ability to tackle the subject. So I asked him one of the burning questions that I had been left with, which is, what can we learn about adult cancer from childhood cancer? And he said, this is a huge area of interest right now. We're trying to figure out when it's best to pull back on treatment to minimize the side effects, and pediatric cancer survivors and survivorship studies about this early generation are helping doctors figure that out. And he said, you really should write that story. The second encounter I had was in a book. You may have actually gleaned from Marissa's comments, the job that tore me away, that was as the children's book editor. Eventually, I was the editor of the New York Times Book Review. And so that job ended up being very time-consuming and involved a lot of reading. But over actually the Christmas vacation one year, again, I do like to go to dark places. I read John Gunther's memoir of his son. Some of you sure have read it, called Death Be Not Proud. For some reason, it used to be assigned often in junior high school and high school, and it's like this incredibly sad book. I don't think it's assigned as often anymore. But John Gunther, who was a journalist who wrote a number of best-selling books, his son Johnny was diagnosed with brain cancer, neuroblastoma, and died in 1947, having just missed the advent of chemotherapy, which was then being discovered through the use of mustard gas, something that I'd read and others among here probably have read too about in Siddhartha Mukherjee's biography of cancer, The Empire of All Maladies. And like many readers, I wept as I read the final chapters of Death Be Not Proud, because this boy Johnny was such an incredible life that had been lost and that could have been saved. And that's when I knew I really had to return to this story. I wanted to write a story about the kids who lived. So in the fall of 2023, I'm getting my years wrong. I think this was in the fall of 2022. I approached my editors at the Times about returning to this story. I had, in the interim, moved from the news side of the New York Times over to the opinion side. And while that doesn't change the fact that all of our stories still need to be reported and fact-checked with the same standards, it does mean that writers are supposed to have an opinion about what they're writing, an argument of some kind to make. And honestly, I didn't know if I had an opinion about pediatric cancer other than it's terrible and needs to be treated, and I hope ultimately it's cured. But I wasn't going to let myself be held back from writing about it, so I decided to write and report and figured that that argument, that opinion would come to me. One thing that people don't necessarily know about journalism is that we don't always know what a story is going to be when we set out to write it. What's often the case is that you have a germ of a story and you don't really know what it's going to become until you start reporting, until you get out there on the streets, or you go to an event, or you start talking and interviewing people about their experiences and their expertise. So I did know going in that what I wanted to focus on was what makes pediatric cancer different from other cancers, that fundamentally, biologically, it's a different animal than adult cancer, and that unlike adult cancers, it poses this life or death struggle for a life that has hardly begun. And that makes pediatric cancer as much an experience for parents as they are for the patients. What, I asked myself, might it be like for the parent of a child diagnosed with cancer? What kinds of challenges would you face? An obvious answer is that there are many, but I decided to home in on this idea of choices, these information that a doctor will present to a parent, and then a parent has to make this terrible decision about how to treat their child. And the fact that whatever information the parent has, it's never entirely clear what the right decision is going to be. Do you put a 9-month-old baby with neuroblastoma through a grueling regimen of chemotherapy for a second time if it's the best chance of survival? Do you put a child through not one round, excruciating round of bone marrow transplant and then a second round? How does a parent decide whether to amputate a child's cancerous leg or to try to treat it, to save it? And these kinds of impossible questions led me to retinoblastoma, a cancer I'd never heard of before. But it, again, posed one of those questions: how does a parent decide whether to remove a child's eye, something that goes against her very instinct as a parent, or to attempt to treat and save it? I knew very little about retinoblastoma before I started reporting, but I thought it was more likely going in that I would talk about something more common, like leukemia or bone cancer. But once I started reporting, I realized that retinoblastoma offers an almost perfect way to illustrate the unique qualities of pediatric cancer to readers, that it is often parents who first spot the disease rather than doctors, that it is the only cancer that can be definitively diagnosed without a biopsy, that it was also the first pediatric cancer to be gene sequenced. And then, through the help of my research assistant who came across the website for One Eye Cancer Hope, I was put in touch with Marissa Gonzalez. And I have to say, from our very first conversation, I knew Marissa would be the key to my story. When I first contacted her, my assistant said, well, she's going to be able to put you in touch with survivors. I didn't know that Marissa herself was a survivor. And all of you, knowing Marissa, would surely understand why within 5 minutes of talking to her, I just knew she was my story. her openness, her determination, her sense of humor, her generosity. It all came through by phone, and then later in the many, many texts we exchanged up to the point of publication and the year since. And that impression also came through just as clearly with her mother, Marty, this formidable woman who brought her baby with her to do graduate research to Easter Island and who advocated so strongly for her child when she became ill. So Marissa's story is also Marty's story. And I knew they would be central to the story I told. Marissa was also instrumental in putting me in touch with other retinoblastoma survivors, people like Clay. Where is Clay? Yes, holding a baby. And DJ Berzon, who you all heard from remotely on Tuesday, as well as the parents of patients like, and I didn't know this until recently, and I know we're going to hear more about her later, but Lisa Hester, mother of 8, who of course recently died this summer. Their stories enlivened and informed and enriched the story I wrote, even if ultimately, in the end, my editors took them out in order to focus around the singular story of Marissa and Marty. But they are in my final piece, their stories are present. And as I began talking to doctors, I realized I also needed to tell a larger story about how the medical profession approached pediatric cancer. And I think you've heard from so many committed doctors here, one of whom was in tears, talking about what this is like for them. I hadn't thought really about how, immensely doctors are affected by treating these young patients. I spoke to Dr. David Nathan, who's now in his 90s and sends like about 10 emails a day to me and I think a whole list of other people about, the politics, basically. But he's someone who had worked along Sidney Farber in the early years. And at one point he said, it takes a certain kind of personality to keep working in this field. He was among the group that treated sort of the first 50 patients with chemotherapy of pediatric cancer, and all of those kids died not from the cancer, but from the treatment, and how hard it was for them to come upon a cure. I was so inspired by the dedication of doctors who continued in this line of treatment despite the challenges, and frankly in awe of their sense of mission and by their underlying optimism, by the fact that unlike so many doctors in the medical profession in this country, they put profit and ego and easy procedures and guarantees of success aside to tackle this disease and to work together in their efforts to do so. So this then became the kernel of my story's argument, that the study of pediatric cancer and the experience of pediatric cancer is inherently collaborative, that the disease and its treatment has to be also studied over the course of a lifetime. From the outset, doctors pooled their data and created longitudinal studies where they continue to assess treatment and its aftermath over a course of a lifetime. I realized that this could and perhaps should be a model of care to approach medicine in this country, not as a moment of time, even holistically a moment in time, but as a lifelong process, that we can't look at medicine as a before and after, that there isn't an end to the story even after a patient is cured or deemed cancer-free. And here is where Marissa's story and this larger story converged. Neither the experience of pediatric cancer nor the treatment of pediatric cancer has a perfect ending or even an ending at all. And in the end, Marissa provided me with both a story I wrote and with its natural ending, which came in her own words, which I'm going to read here. It was the last words in the story. I find it both overwhelming and encouraging to look back on the life that retinoblastoma set forth for me. I have no idea what my life would look like had I not been a baby with cancer, Marissa wrote. That is why I choose instead to focus on what I can control and what I can do with a cancer-filled life. That's the story I ultimately tried to write. And it was incredibly validating when I filed my story to our health and science editor, someone who'd been working in for 2 decades in health journalism, and she said, wow, I've edited and read hundreds of stories about cancer, and this is a story about cancer that is totally new to me. My hope is that Marissa's life story will shine a light on the challenges and resilience of an entire generation, and that the rest of yours do as well. As all of you have gathered here know very well, there are so many incredible stories that have yet to be told. And to return to that earlier uncomfortable conversation I had with my skeptical friend about why I should write this story as a journalist, I think that all of our stories are additive to this greater narrative, and they all work in concert together. And I hope that my story contributes to that, but it is far from the only one. All of you gathered here have stories that need to be told. Thank you. Thank you. I realize it's lunchtime. I don't know if anyone has any questions. You feel free to barrage me with questions about the New York Times, either here or over lunch. But if any of you have any questions at all, I'm happy to answer. No, people are hungry. All right, we'll go eat. Thank you.